Why is a 30-year-old Toyota engine worth more today than the brand new supercar sitting on the showroom floor? Collectors are paying six figures for a piece of 90s iron while turning their backs on modern technology. To understand why, you have to go back to a time when Japanese automakers made a secret pact called the Gentleman's Agreement. It was a promise to limit horsepower, but for Toyota, it became a convenient lie. They built an engine that obeyed the rules on paper, but shattered them on the street. This is the story of the 2JZ GTE, and why its legend only grows as new cars lose their soul. To understand why this engine exists, you have to look at the world it was born into. The late 1980s in Japan was a time of unprecedented financial excess known as the bubble economy. Japanese corporations were flush with cash, and for the automotive industry, this meant research budgets were effectively unlimited. It was a golden age where manufacturers could build cars simply to prove they could, without worrying about profit margins. Honda was building the NSX to fight Ferrari, and Mazda was perfecting the rotary engine. But in 1989, Nissan dropped a bomb on the industry that shattered the status quo. They released the R32 Skyline GTR, powered by the RB26DE TT. It was a technological marvel designed to dominate Group A racing. It had twin-turbos, sophisticated all-wheel drive, and a racing pedigree that terrified the competition. The Australian press nicknamed it Godzilla because it was a monster that ate everything in its path. On the street and the track, the GTR was untouchable. Toyota, meanwhile, was in a difficult spot. They were the giant of the industry, but they were viewed as conservative and safe. They made reliable sedans like the Camry and the Crown. Their flagship sports car, the A80 Supra, was a grand tourer and not a race car. It was heavy soft and frankly a bit boring compared to the high-tech weaponry coming out of Nissan and Honda. Toyota needed a halo car to shed this image, but their current hardware was not up to the task. Worse yet, the existing performance engine from Toyota, called the 7M GTE, had a tarnished reputation. While it was a decent 3.0-liter engine on paper, it suffered from a notorious flaw. The head gasket was prone to failure due to incorrect factory torque specifications on the head bolts. If you pushed a 7M too hard, it would blow. It was an embarrassing blemish for a company that prided itself on perfection. Toyota tried to fix this with the 1JZ GTE in 1990. This was a 2.5-liter engine that solved many of the reliability issues. It was smoother and revved freely, but it was still a stopgap measure. It lacked the displacement and the sheer brute force needed to unseat Nissan. It was a good engine, but it was not a legend. The executives at Toyota had had enough. They needed a new flagship engine for the upcoming next-generation Supra. They handed the project to Chief Engineer Isao Suzuki. The mandate was simple but impossible: build a world beater. But unlike Nissan, who chased high-revving racing glory with the RB26, Toyota wanted something else. They wanted torque, they wanted refinement, and above all, they wanted absolute, unquestionable durability. They wanted an engine that would never break no matter how hard the customers drove it. This decision sparked an internal revolution. With the target painted squarely on the back of Nissan, the engineers at Toyota retreated to the drawing board to create something indestructible. They ignored the trend toward lightweight aluminum blocks that was sweeping the industry. Instead, they looked back to heavy cast iron. They were not just trying to match the competition, they were trying to build something that would last forever. The rivalry with Nissan had lit a fire under the conservative giant, and the result would be a piece of iron that would change car culture forever. To understand the soul of the 2JZ, you must first understand the material choice that defined it. In an era when competitors were moving to lightweight aluminum to shave milliseconds, Toyota went the other direction. They chose cast iron for the engine block. Iron is heavy, it is dense. But iron has a singular virtue that aluminum lacks. It is incredibly stiff. This decision was the foundation of everything that followed. The engineers utilized what is called a closed-deck design. In this layout, the top of the block is solid metal supporting the cylinder walls, rather than leaving them freestanding. This means that when you force massive amounts of compressed air into the combustion chamber, the cylinder walls cannot flex or distort. This structural rigidity is why you can double the horsepower without the block cracking. It is a fortress made of iron. Inside this fortress, they placed a rotating assembly that seemed designed for industrial machinery rather than a sports car. The crankshaft is forged steel, not cast. It spins on 7 massive main bearings. That is one bearing between every cylinder, holding the crank in a vice grip to prevent flex. Beneath the pistons, they installed oil squirters. These small nozzles spray cooling oil directly onto the bottom of the pistons to manage the intense thermal load of turbocharging. It was overkill for a street car producing 276 horsepower. But that was the point. They were not building an engine to last through the warranty period. They were building it to last forever. This heavy-duty philosophy created a distinct personality compared to its rival. The Nissan RB26 was a 2.6-liter engine designed specifically for racing rules. It was over-square, meaning the bore was wider than the stroke was long. It liked to rev high and scream near the red line. The Toyota 2JZ was different. It was a 3.0-liter square engine, meaning the bore and stroke were exactly equal at 86 millimeters. That extra displacement gave it superior low-end torque. You did not have to wring its neck to get it moving. It had a deep well of power available from the moment you touched the throttle. While the Nissan was a frantic sprinter, the Toyota was a heavy-hitting prizefighter. To deliver that power with the refinement Toyota customers expected, they engineered a complex sequential twin-turbo system. Most twin-turbo cars of the era used parallel setups where both turbos worked together, often resulting in significant lag. Toyota chose a harder path. At low engine speeds, all the exhaust gas is routed to the first, smaller turbine. This gives you instant response, leaving a stoplight. As the engine speed rises past 4,000 revolutions per minute, a complex system of valves opens to bring the second turbo online. They work in unison at the top end to provide a rush of power. It was a nightmare of vacuum lines to maintain, but when it worked, it turned a violent surge of boost into a sophisticated, linear wave of torque. To transfer this power to the wheels, Toyota didn't skimp on the transmission either. They partnered with German manufacturer Getrag to develop the V166-speed manual gearbox. Like the engine, this transmission was comically overbuilt. While other gearboxes would shatter under the torque of a modified engine, the V160 was essentially bulletproof, capable of handling massive horsepower without modification. Perhaps the most critical decision for the Legend was the compression ratio. They set it at 8.5 to 1. This is relatively low, which leaves a massive margin of safety. It meant the engine was not stressed in its factory tune. It was barely trying. Tuners later realized this low compression combined with the iron block meant you could simply turn up the boost pressure without changing anything else. The engine had what engineers call headroom. It was capable of handling far more stress than the factory ever applied to it. By 1993, the team had finished their masterpiece. They had created a triumph of over-engineering that prioritized longevity over lightness. But an engine is useless without a chassis. They had built the heart of a beast, but now they needed a body that could handle the soul of this machine. The machine that arrived in 1993 looked like nothing else on the road. The A80 Supra was a radical departure from the boxy styling of the 80s. It was all curves and muscle, a design that felt organic rather than industrial. Toyota's designers looked back to their own history for inspiration, borrowing the long hood and short rear deck proportions from the legendary 2000 GT of the 1960s. But where that car was delicate, the new Supra was aggressive. It sat wide and low, dominated by a massive rear wing that became its signature. The interior was designed like a fighter jet cockpit, with the entire dashboard curving around the driver, isolating them from the passenger. It was a clear statement that this car was for driving, not just riding, but the real story was what lay under that long hood. In Japan, there was a peculiar arrangement known as the Gentleman's Agreement. To avoid a horsepower war that might attract government regulation, all Japanese automakers voluntarily capped their advertised power at 276 horsepower. On paper, the Supra adhered to this limit. In reality, it was a lie. The twin-turbo 2 JZGTE was producing significantly more, likely closer to 320 horsepower right off the showroom floor. It was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a supercar engine detuned just enough to keep the bureaucrats happy while delivering shattering performance to the driver. When the automotive press finally got their hands on it, the numbers were shocking. Car and Driver magazine recorded a 0 to 60 time of 4.6 seconds. That was faster than a Ferrari 348. It was faster than a Porsche 911 Turbo of the same era. It was embarrassing cars that cost twice as much. The Supra was not just fast for a Toyota, it was fast, period. It was a giant killer. It proved that you did not need an Italian badge or a German price tag to experience world-class acceleration. The sequential turbos masked the lag, delivering a relentless surge of power that kept pulling long after other cars had run out of breath. It wasn't just about straight-line speed either. Toyota equipped the turbo models with massive 4-piston brake calipers and large vented rotors. The stopping power was just as violent as the acceleration. In testing, the Supra recorded a 70-0 braking distance of 149 feet. This was a record that stood for years, besting even the exotic hypercars of the day. The chassis was rigid, the suspension was sophisticated, and the car felt incredibly planted. It was a complete package, a grand tourer that could hunt supercars on the weekend and commute to work on Monday. Yet, for all its engineering dominance, the A80 was not an immediate sales success. In fact, it struggled. The problem was the timing. By 1993, the Japanese bubble economy had burst. The yen was strong, which drove up the export price. In the United States, a turbo Supra cost over $40,000. That was a staggering amount of money for a Toyota in the early 90s. For the price of a Supra, you could buy a Corvette with a V8 and have cash left over. At the same time, the market was shifting. Drivers were moving away from low-slung coupes and toward a new trend called the sport utility vehicle. The Supra was an engineering marvel, but it was a sales disappointment. Dealerships had trouble moving them. They sat on lots, gathering dust, appreciated only by a small cult of die-hard enthusiasts who knew what the car really was. It seemed destined to fade away, a forgotten masterpiece of the bubble era that was too good for its own good. It was a car that commanded respect, but not sales volume. In total, only about 45,230 A80 Supras were produced worldwide over nearly a decade. By the late 90s, it was quietly pulled from many markets. The story should have ended there. But then, Hollywood came calling. For a while, it seemed the Supra might fade away as just another fast coupe, until a specific movie changed everything. A film arrived that did not just entertain audiences, it rewired the brain of an entire generation. The Fast and the Furious was not a critical darling, but for the Toyota Supra, it was a resurrection. When the character Brian O'Connor, played by Paul Walker, pulled the tarp off a rusted, non-running A80 shell in a garage, the script called it a piece of junk. But when the hood was popped and the 2JZGTE was revealed, the tone shifted to reverence. This was the moment the general public learned what the diehards already knew. This wasn't a car. It was a weapon waiting to be forged. The film's climax involved a bright orange Supra, plastered in nuclear gladiator graphics, hunting down a black Dodge Charger. But the scene that truly cemented the legend happened earlier. It is the moment the orange Supra pulls up next to a Ferrari F355 Spider on the Pacific Coast Highway. The Ferrari driver sneers at the Toyota, dismissing it as a cheap toy. It was a moment that encapsulated the class warfare of car culture, the exotic establishment versus the tuner upstart. When Brian O'Connor turns to his passenger and says, "Smoke him," the Supra's turbos spool, and it leaves the Italian stallion in the dust. A message was sent to millions of teenagers. You didn't need a trust fund to go fast. You just needed a Toyota and a wrench. The scene was a promise. With enough boost, a Toyota could humble a masterpiece from Maranello. That specific orange car became the face of the platform. It took a vehicle that had been a refined, heavy grand tourer and rebranded it instantly as a street racing outlaw. The phrase 10-second car entered the global lexicon. Before this, a 10-second quarter mile was a metric strictly for drag strips and American muscle cars. The movie normalized the idea that a Japanese import could, and should, be capable of that velocity. It shifted the identity of the Supra from a competitor to the Corvette into something mythical. It was no longer just a Toyota. It was a hero's sword. It stripped away the gentleman's agreement pretense and replaced it with raw aggression. The stock body lines were hidden under aggressive body kits and massive aluminum spoilers. It wasn't elegant anymore. It was loud, brash, and unapologetic. The mythos was deepened by the man behind the wheel. Paul Walker was not just an actor reciting lines. He was a genuine enthusiast who lived the culture the film portrayed. He owned Supras in real life. He raced them. He understood the mechanical soul of the two JZ. This blurred the lines between fiction and reality. When fans saw Walker driving a Supra, they weren't just seeing a character. They were seeing an endorsement from one of their own. His tragic death years later only solidified the car as a sacred object in the automotive canon, forever linked to his memory. But the indoctrination started even earlier, for those too young to drive. The Gran Turismo video game series had already placed the Supra in the hands of millions of children. In the digital world, the Castrol Tom's Supra was a pixelated god, capable of winning any race against any competition. Players learned about upgrading intercoolers and swapping turbines before they ever touched a steering wheel. They learned that horsepower was a variable, not a constant. They learned that if you wanted to win, you bought the Toyota. By the time these players got their driver's licenses, the desire for a 2JZ was already hardwired into their DNA. This media explosion had a tangible effect on the real world. Before 2001, you could find used Supras lingering on dealership lots for reasonable prices. After the movie, the depreciation curve inverted. Values stopped falling and started climbing. The Supra had transcended its status as a machine and became a pop culture icon. It was the poster on the wall, the hero in the movie, and the king of the video game. The world had finally woken up to the potential of the iron block. But while the movie introduced the Supra to the masses in 2001, the real revolution had already begun years earlier in the underground. Long before Paul Walker shifted a gear on a cinema screen, a different kind of drama was unfolding on the drag strips of America and the highways of Japan. In the late 90s, while the general public saw a heavy Toyota Grand Tourer, serious tuners saw a bomb waiting to go off. They began experimenting with the 2JZ and discovered something impossible. Usually, when you double the horsepower of a factory engine, it explodes. Rods snap, blocks crack, and head gaskets surrender. But with the Supra, they turned up the boost, and the engine just asked for more. It was a revelation that rippled through the aftermarket community like a shockwave. The gentleman's agreement had hidden a monster. Tuners realized that Toyota had left a staggering amount of potential on the table. With simple bolt-on modifications, a larger exhaust, an open intake, and a boost controller, owners were instantly jumping from 300 to 400 horsepower. But that was just the appetizer. The real legend was born when shops like Top Secret in Japan and Titan Motorsports in the United States decided to see where the breaking point actually was. Smokey Nagata, the founder of Top Secret, became an outlaw folk hero for taking massive horsepower Supras to public highways. He famously hit nearly 200 miles per hour on a British highway in the rain, a stunt that resulted in his immediate arrest, a night in jail, and a permanent ban from the UK. It was reckless, illegal, and exactly the kind of outlaw behavior that builds a legend. Meanwhile, on the quarter mile, Titan was pushing the platform into the 9, 8, and eventually 6-second territories. This gave rise to the most pervasive myth in car culture, the 1,000 horsepower stock motor. We need to clarify this because the reality is more nuanced than the internet comments suggest. You cannot simply take a junkyard 2JZ, bolt on a turbo the size of a watermelon, and make 1,000 horsepower reliably without changing a screw. The factory pistons and connecting rods are strong, but they are not magic. They will usually bend or melt around the 700 or 800 horsepower mark. However, the myth exists for a very specific reason. The cast iron block and the forged crankshaft, the literal spine of the engine, can actually handle 1,000 horsepower. In fact, they can handle far more. This is unheard of in modern engineering. In almost any other platform, reaching 4-digit horsepower requires a completely custom billet or aftermarket block. With the Toyota, the factory foundation is strong enough to support a skyscraper. It is the block itself that is the miracle. The sound of this revolution was distinct. A high horsepower 2JZ doesn't scream like a Ferrari. V12, it sounds like aggressive industrial machinery. At the drag strip, the violent gunfire-like popping of two-step anti-lag systems and the terrifying whoosh of massive single turbochargers became the soundtrack of the import scene. It was a sound that commanded immediate silence and respect from the crowd, because everyone knew what it meant. It meant a car that looked like a comfortable daily driver was about to embarrass a dedicated race car. This durability created a new phenomenon, the engine swap. The 2JZ became the universal donor organ for the automotive world. When drifting exploded in popularity, drivers of the Nissan Silvia, a chassis with a fragile four-cylinder engine, started ripping out their Nissan hearts and dropping in Toyota iron. It was sacrilege to the purists, but it was simple math to the racers. Why spend $20,000 building a fragile Nissan engine when you could buy a used 2JZ for $2,000 and make more power reliably? Soon, the engine was finding its way into BMWs, Ford Mustangs, and even classic muscle cars. It became the default answer to the question, how do I go fast without going broke? The aftermarket support ballooned into a massive economy. You could buy parts to make a Supra do anything: drift, drag, time attack, or highway cruising. The engine had transcended its original purpose. It was no longer just the power plant for the Supra. It was the gold standard for internal combustion. It was the ultimate proof that over-engineering pays off. But while the engine was proving its immortality on the streets and strips of the world, inside the corporate offices of Toyota, the clock was ticking. The engineers had built a legend, but the accountants were looking at the bottom line, and they did not like what they saw. The engine was immortal on the street, but inside the boardroom, it was already dead. The forces that killed the A80 Supra and the 2JZ were a convergence of tightening regulations and cold economics. By the early 2000s, the automotive world was waking up to a new reality of emissions targets. The Euro 3 and Euro 4 standards were looming on the horizon, and the 2JZ, for all its power, was a dirty engine. It was a child of the 80s, designed when fuel was cheap and the atmosphere was an afterthought. To modernize the heavy iron block with direct injection and advanced catalyst systems would have cost millions in research and development. Toyota looked at the sales charts and realized it wasn't worth the money. The sports car market had cratered. The generation that bought the Supra in 1993 was now buying SUVs to haul their families. The low-volume, high-cost coupe was a financial burden. Furthermore, Toyota was undergoing a spiritual shift. They were launching the Prius. They were rebranding themselves as the green, sensible company of the future. A twin-turbo gas guzzler was an embarrassment to this new identity. So, in 2002, the line stopped. There was no fanfare. They simply turned off the lights, leaving a void in the lineup that would not be filled for 17 years. When Toyota finally decided to fill that void with the A90 Supra in 2019, the response was complicated. They chose not to build a new engine. Instead, they partnered with BMW, borrowing the German chassis and the B58 inline-six engine. To the accountants, this was brilliant. To the faithful, it was a betrayal. The internet exploded with insults, labeling the car the Supra and mourning the fact that a Supra didn't have a Toyota heart. From a technical standpoint, the B58 is a masterpiece of modern engineering. It makes great power and gets incredible fuel economy. But it is built from aluminum. It is complex. It relies on plastic timing, chain guides, and Van OS systems that feel fragile compared to the sledgehammer simplicity of the 2JZ. The new engine is a tool. The old engine was a monument. It highlighted just how much the industry had changed. We moved from building things to last forever to building things to last a lease term. However, the 2JZ refused to fade away. Thanks to the 25-year import rule in the United States, a new wave of engines began arriving from Japan inside Toyota Aristos and JDM Supras. This influx kept the drifting and tuning scenes alive, ensuring that the distinct sound of the straight six continued to echo at tracks across America. Yet, there is a bitter irony in this survival. The popularity of the engine has destroyed the affordability that made it famous. The young tuners who grew up worshiping the Supra in video games can no longer afford to buy one. Prices have surged from $20,000 to well over six figures for pristine examples. The Supra has become an investment asset for the wealthy, locked away in climate-controlled garages rather than being driven. It is the ultimate validation of the engine's legacy. The market has decided that a 30-year-old Toyota is worth more than the brand-new model sitting on the showroom floor. The tuners built the legend, but the collectors inherited the earth. Conclusion: the last of the Iron Kings. Looking back, the comparison to the modern era only clarifies what the 2JZ really was. It was not just metal, it was a physical monument to a time when too good was the engineering standard. The world has moved on to electrification and efficiency, leaving the heavy iron blocks of the 90s behind, as relics of a glorious gas-burning past. But as long as there is fuel to burn and asphalt to conquer, the roar of the 2JZ will remind us of what is possible when engineers are allowed to dream without limits. We will likely never see an engine built like this again, and that is why it will never be forgotten. Subscribe for more stories of lost automotive greatness.